Good afternoon. I'm Victor Schaffner, Director of Communications and Advocacy with the University of Delaware Center for Disabilities Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's Lunchtime Learning Zoom webinar, Disrupting Ableism, Understanding the Nature of Disability Oppression and Its Outcomes in Society, presented by Dr. Priya Lalvani. Thank you for joining us. Today's Lunchtime Learning event is a particularly special one for CDS, as we are delighted to be co-hosting it with the Delaware Network for Excellence in Autism, the DNEA. And in just a moment, I will be turning things over to Alicia Fletcher, Director of the DNEA, who will introduce you to Dr. Lalvani. After Dr. Lalvani's presentation, there should be time for her to answer several questions. If you wish to submit a question, you can do so in Zoom's chat field by typing or by using speech-to-text dictation. Alicia will then pose some of your questions in the time we have remaining to Dr. Lalvani. Today's event is being live captioned. In the coming days, we expect to load a caption video of the event to YouTube and our websites. Also, at the conclusion of today's Lunchtime Learning session, you will receive a brief survey that asks a few questions about the webinar. We ask that you complete it and send it back to us today or tomorrow. Thank you, everyone, once again for joining us. And with that, I'll turn things over to Alicia.
Thank you, Victor. Good morning and welcome, everyone. My name is Alicia Fletcher, and I'm the Director of the Delaware Network for Excellence in Autism, or the DNEA. The DNEA was created through Senate Bill 93 and is Delaware's statewide training and technical assistance center for autism spectrum disorder. Today, we are very excited to be co-sponsoring Dr. Priya Lalvani. Dr. Lalvani is a professor at Montclair State University. She holds a PhD in developmental psychology, teaches courses in disability studies, and is the coordinator for graduate programs in inclusive education. Through her research, she seeks to confront ableism in schools and society and to problematize the practice of segregated education for many students with disabilities in school. She is the co-author of the book Undoing Ableism, Teaching About Disability in K-12 Classrooms, and the editor of Constructing the Mother, with the M in parentheses, Narratives of Disabilities, Motherhood, and the Politics of Normal. The DNEA and CDS is excited to have her join all of us today to talk about disrupting ableism. What is ableism and what does it mean to disrupt it? Dr. Lalvani, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Alicia, for that lovely introduction. I am honored to be here with all of you and very excited to present today. So without further ado, because I have a lot to share with you all, I will share my slides and we shall begin. So, okay, here we are. And my presentation for today is Disrupting Ableism, Understanding the Nature of Disability Oppression and Becoming Allies for Disability Justice. So the aims for today, very briefly, are that I would like for us to consider the ways in which stigmas about disability get perpetuated, gain an introduction. For some of you, it might be an introduction. Many of you might already be familiar with the concept of ableism. But just to sort of get a conceptual idea about that, learn to recognize ableism that is embedded in our practices, our language, our cultural products, rethink, or at least start to rethink the ways in which normalcy is defined and constructed in society, and consider ways to become an ally to the disability community and work to increase justice, inclusivity, and acceptance for people with disabilities. So I'll just put out some framing questions as we start. So, you know, I understand that the audience are professionals. Many or most or all of us will come into contact with people with disabilities at some point, if not professionally, then personally. So the framing questions here are, what are some ways in which professionals may be complicit inadvertently in disability oppression through their choice of language or actions, and what can be gained when we position ourselves as allies instead of experts about disability, and how can we as professionals or families or people really contribute to combating ableism more broadly. So, all right, I've thrown out the term ableism. It's the title of the presentation. For those that are not entirely familiar with it, I'll give a sort of working conceptual definition of it. So ableism really refers to negative attitudes and a devaluing of individuals with disabilities broadly. It manifests as institutional policies and practices that are discriminatory and result in disadvantage to individuals with disabilities. The third bullet point is what I use when I'm asked by friends, family members, what is this ableism term? Really, it's akin, analogous to the other isms, if you will, racism, sexism, classism we're familiar with. That's maybe the quickest way to understand it. Ableism, like the other isms, unfolds as a pervasive system of oppression at the individual, cultural, and institutional levels. It can result in a lack of access and a privileging of non-disabled ways of learning, moving, communicating, or interacting. Schools and society alike are set up to work for neurotypical people, right? So the rules, the policies, the expectations of how we communicate, how we learn, how we demonstrate learning, how we demonstrate relationships, all of those seem to be set up in advance that work for some people, not necessarily for all people. So I just want to put out there that as we critique some of our practices, it's not a criticism, but a critique. It's fair to assume, of course, that those in the helping professions, family members who come into contact with people with disabilities, obviously have the best interest of children in mind. And I would assume aim to act in their best interests. However, the question I'm putting forth here is, are there times when professionals or parents' decisions about children with disabilities, are they at odds with the perspectives or agendas of disabled activists? So often, we might be familiar with this, professionals will justify, because they believe genuinely, their decisions as means of improving outcomes for individuals with disabilities. Today, I'm going to invite you to consider whether some of these decisions that we make, some of the actions, some of the language, may actually be perceived by disabled activists as working against their agendas. So let's start with the idea of disability as identity. We don't think about disability as identity. Traditionally, when we think about disability, we think about disability as a problem, a deficit, an impairment, something's wrong, it has to be fixed, it has to be corrected, you want to help that, you want to help people. We're not accustomed to thinking about disability as really an identity group, right? People with disabilities actually comprise the largest minority group in the USA. And one that has been historically marginalized, oppressed. People with disabilities have a history of denial of human rights, incarceration, forced sterilization, the eugenics movement, institutionalization. So there's a history there of a collective history of a group of people. People with disabilities have also more recently forged a disability rights movement and are part of a disability culture. Yet, we don't really talk about it that much. Many people, and I work with teachers every day, I'm a teacher educator. Many of the teachers that I work with will share with me that they were not familiar with the existence of a disability culture. They've never heard those two words actually in juxtaposition. They were not aware of the disability rights movement. They were not aware of disability history. There seems to be, even today, a stigma and shame around disability. Disability seen as something to be fixed or eliminated at all costs, get rid of it. So when we don't talk about disability openly, it sends an implicit message that the topic has little relevance to those without disabilities. It also renders people with disabilities invisible, and it reinforces ableism. I want to talk about a very, very pervasive myth that exists about children and their noticing of disability. Especially among educators, other professionals who work with individuals with disabilities, there's this idea that young children are innocent, they don't notice. And this idea in society that not noticing disability is a good thing, right? You get, I don't know how many times I've heard, oh, he has a disability, but you would never even know it. Right? And many of you might have come across that idea, like nobody noticed, you can't even tell, he blends right in. So when you think about it, this is a manifestation of ableism, right? It would be akin to saying, you know, we don't notice somebody's race or their culture or their ethnicity or their gender. And many professionals would like to address it, but feel concerned, fearful, or don't know how to take on questions or issues related to disability. In fact, research shows us that young children are likely to notice differences, all kinds of differences. And why should they not, right? Children are curious, as they should be. When children, in fact, children have by age 5 internalized preferences and biases based on disability. When children don't ask, and even adults actually, openly discuss and ask questions about disability, it doesn't mean that they haven't noticed. It suggests that they have internalized social hierarchies. In fact, they've learned that some differences are okay to mention. Other differences, it's rude to mention, or we don't talk about it, right? And that can't be a good thing. If I'm not supposed to talk about it or mention it, it can't be a good thing. This is very similar to colorblind ideology, right? This idea that we don't notice race, or like we, you know, I don't see race or color. It's a very similar and is rooted really in ableism and racism. So today I'm going to talk about different ways in which ableism is perpetuated, in ways that we as professionals can be mindful. So one is through cultural products. And when I say cultural products, I mean media, films, TV, advertisement, visual media, literature, children's books, and all of that. Another way is through the assumptions, and this is kind of interesting. A lot of my work is about professionals and their relationship with families of children with disabilities, and how their discourses actually is rooted in ableism and perpetuates ableism. The third is our choice of language. And the fourth is the activities that we choose that are intended to increase awareness. So let's look at the first one, disability in cultural products. And I want you to sort of ask yourself as you're listening, how is disability represented in the cultural products that I'm consuming, right? Because we are all consumers of cultural products, and we need to learn to become more critical and aware consumers of what we are consuming or we are made to consume on a daily basis. How our ableist narratives about disability get reinforced through media, literature, language, and images. So some of the most common themes about disability in cultural products, here they are, and they're certainly not restricted to just these. But as I'm speaking, maybe the audience, all of you can think about examples, right, of movies you've seen or TV shows or books, characters. You know, this idea of overcoming disability is this idea that, you know, he had a disability, but he tried, he worked hard, you know, the Christopher Reeve syndrome, he worked, now he can do it, he can get up, you know, he worked to overcome it. It's almost an expectation that if you have a disability, you are expected to work to overcome it. And you're a hero if you do. Disability as tragedy or burden, something that's sad that has happened. It is represented as a sad thing that makes people depressed or miserable or unhappy. Life with a disability is not worth living. You know, certainly there's many films about that, right? Me Before You, I think, Whose Life Is It Anyway? I think there's one about the boxer, I forget the name. This idea that we are presented with, that this character has a disability, and they would rather die. They want to be put out of their misery. And you have to wonder, like, who was consulted about the storyline? How many people in that position actually do make that choice, et cetera, et cetera. Redemption for non-disabled people, this idea that by befriending a disabled person, the non-disabled person learns empathy, learns to become a better person. It's almost like the disabled person is there to make the non-disabled person get, more karma points. Rain Man, if you will, it comes to mind. Disability as punishment or divine justice is a very common theme, particularly in children's literature and adult literature. By the way, dating as far back as many religious texts across traditions, this idea that one is punished with blindness or struck down with a disability, and one is healed or cured if one is a good person. In fact, as an example, the original Grimm's version of Cinderella ends with roughly the sentence, I quote, and so for their evil ways, the stepsisters were struck with blindness or had their eyes plucked out by doves and had to live the rest of their lives in blindness. The message there for children is hardly subtle, right? They were bad, they were evil, they're going to have to live as blind people. And these are not consciously internalized by us. Like, we don't sit down and say, oh, or instruct children in that way. But these are messages that we might unconsciously internalize, that juxtaposition of evil or bad doing with being punished. And of course, the most disturbing thing, even worse, I would think, than negative representation, is the fact that disability is simply not represented or underrepresented, which again, as I said before, renders people with disabilities invisible and irrelevant. Here are how people with disabilities are represented in media and literature. This is not based on my research, but there's a wide breadth of research out there that has analyzed media and literature. And these are some common tropes that will appear. Objects of fear, sinister people, the villain, the ones with the facial deformities or the scars or the burns, then potentially violent people. Alternatively, we go the other extreme, and they are objects of pity. Your Oliver Twist, your sort of sad, pathetic person, or they are the laughable, bumbling, comedic character, the one with the speech impediment, I thought, putty tat. They could have genius abilities, which is a huge stereotype. And I apologize because somebody's car alarm seems to be going off there. And then there's the inspirational characters, as well as the objects of, I'm sorry, I really apologize for that. Objects of curiosity, and I'm thinking of the dwarfs in Snow White. Okay, I'm gonna go, thank God that has stopped. When you look at the counter narratives of people with disabilities, and what do we mean by counter narratives? We mean the narratives that push back, the narratives that resist. The narratives of people with disabilities is what we should be looking for, sharing with young people. These are the themes that come out, actually, very different than what we just saw. You see a resistance to otherness. You see a redefining of disability and normalcy. You see a reclaiming of language and a history, right? So when we want to be consumers of cultural products, as professionals, we want to sort of seek these out. We want to look at the memoirs and the narratives or the stories, films that are made by people with disabilities, and what do they tell us? How do they reject stereotypes and tropes? What do they draw attention to? And one thing that comes out when you look at these is that when you look at the counter narratives of people with disabilities, the primary problem is usually is ableism, right? For many disabled activists, the impairment is not highlighted as the biggest problem for people with disabilities. Rather, ableism, lack of acceptance and lack of access in society is highlighted as the biggest issue or problem. Now let's look at the second thing that I had talked about. Another way in which ableism gets perpetuated is by the common tropes about families of disabilities that are upheld actually by educators, professionals, mental health professionals, and so forth. And this is really the focus of a lot of my own research. So I've sort of broken it down into three issues that I'll talk about today. One is parent as problem, parent in denial, and grief and mourning associated with the birth of a child with a disability. Parent as problem, and I say bad mother because disproportionately mothers, because it's not just about ableism, but it's also about sexism and how gendered this becomes. There's actually a long history of ascribing blame for children's disabilities to their parents. In fact, in the earliest Western civilizations, Greek and Roman civilizations, the belief was that if a child was born with a disability, the parents had obviously offended the gods. It was their fault. They had done something bad. This is the history of how the thinking has evolved, or not evolved, actually. In the 19th century, the institutionalizing of children with disabilities was partly justified based on a belief that some parents, the parents of children with disabilities, were unfit parents, right? Among many other groups. So, there's intersections of race, disability, gender, and class, as they all played out. In the 20th century, thank you so much, Dr. Freud, the blame explicitly shifted to mothers. In fact, Freud explicitly instructed psychotherapists to not engage with mothers because they were emotional, irrational, could not be reasoned with, and their interference would only harm the treatment of the child. So I'm just putting the sort of historical context of where some of these ideas have come from and how they become lodged in our collective unconsciousness. Many of you might be familiar with the theory of the refrigerator mother, which was the popular cause for autism based in psychoanalytic theory in the mid-20th century. The idea that the cold woman, the frigid, cold woman, the mother who was not able to form a bond with her own children, caused autism. And I think many of you here are probably familiar with that. In present day, and this is based on a lot of my own work, mothers who, we have the context of prenatal genetic testing now. And this idea that women who choose to continue their pregnancies after a prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome are making an irrational or irresponsible choice. That is a very, very common and dominant discourse in society, but it is also actually perpetuated or promoted by mental health professionals and medical professionals. In my research, many mothers that I spoke to said that they were explicitly, they got this message from their own doctors, their own therapists, and so forth. Then there's this idea that parents are in denial for a period of time after they have a child with a disability. There's a cultural narrative that just is not questioned, that remains unquestioned. Parents are particularly, first of all, parents are expected to be in denial for a little while. Parents are particularly positioned as being in denial when they are in disagreement with professionals. In a breadth of research, it appears that when parents who advocate for inclusive education, particularly when their children have intellectual disabilities or autism, I should add here, are thought to be in denial about the extent of their children's quote unquote problems. I'm going to give you an example of what I'm talking about right here. through an example. So I did an analysis of textbooks that many almost social workers, psychologists, the helping professions in their in-service training. Through their coursework and in-service training, future professionals are actually explicitly taught, indoctrinated to expect that the parent of a child with a disability is likely to be in denial for a little bit of time, right? Based on this Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief framework that was never intended to be used for in this context. So here I have an example of a textbook that has been used, very commonly. And this is just a bit, but I have a breadth of research on that. The parental defense mechanism of denial interferes with an objective appraisal of a situation or an event. So here, an in-service professional is instructed, right? Parents are likely to be in denial. But here's what's interesting to me. The objective appraisal they are talking about is assumed to be that of the professionals, right? That is objective, apparently. The parent's interpretation is positioned as denial. That's the problem. Moreover, I question that disability is positioned here as an absolute and objective reality rather than a sociopolitical construct. And this is just one example, but as I said in my analysis of textbooks, denial, the word denial in the context of parents comes up pretty much in every context, in every book. The third thing is the framing of a child with a disability as grief and tragedy. And so all of this comes from Kubler-Ross's grief theory, which was, as I said, not intended to interpret the birth of a child with a disability, but was the 5 stages of grief for terminal illness and death. But again, in service training, professionals learn that parents are likely to experience mourning, grief, tragedy, and it's framed that way. Now, I am not, by the way, suggesting that the birth of a child with a disability does not come with negative emotions. My own research is about the experience of the birth of a child with a disability. I'm not at all suggesting that there aren't complicated, complex, and difficult, even negative emotions that accompany a diagnosis. However, I'm inverting the gaze and I'm reframing the question, right? My work is about if there are negative emotions, if there is grieving and grief, and many parents tell me they do experience that. My question is not whether it's there, but my question is what is the grief attributed to? Is it solely a result of the diagnosis and impairment? Does it reside within the child and their impairment? The question that I'm asking is, if a parent experiences negative emotions in response to the diagnosis, what is the grief attributed to? Where can I locate the source of that grief? And my work is about exploring the sociopolitical contexts that allow that grief, that assume that grief, that explicitly actually inform parents that grief is expected, right? So there's a construction of this idea of tragedy. Disability as tragedy is constructed in our society, upheld by professionals. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the choice of language and activities that we as professionals engage in. And I thought I'd make it a little bit more fun for you by giving you some vignettes. All of these vignettes come from my personal experiences of things that I've either been at or experienced. So vignette number 1. Janelle is a counselor at a recreation center for children with cerebral palsy. During their annual disability awareness event, she helped organize and facilitate activities aimed at helping children understand CP. She created an activity in which the children attempted to button their coats and tie their shoelaces with socks over their hands. This was done to demonstrate the difficulties faced by kids with CP and to teach empathy. Simultaneously, other children were to navigate tasks with blindfolds on or cotton balls stuffed in their ears in order to simulate the experience of visual and hearing impairment. At the end of the day, the students said they were amazed at how much they learned about the difficulties faced by people with disabilities on a daily basis. Some students said it taught them to be more kind and patient when interacting with those who have disabilities. So we're going to sort of, it would be great if we could be together and engaging in dialogue about this together. But let me go to the next slide. So I just want to first say that disability simulations, what are disability simulations? And many of you might be familiar with this, right? Any activity or exercise in which a person sort of pretends to have a disability, simulates the experience by either putting on a blindfold or going around in a wheelchair all day, or, you know, sort of covering their ears so they can't hear, and that kind of thing. That's what I mean by disability simulations. And FYI, disability simulations are possibly the most popular and most common tool to teach about disability. Schools do it. I've been to numerous schools where Disability Awareness Day includes this kind of activity. Universities do it. I've certainly seen that. Workplaces, organizations, clinics, centers. So the idea is to teach people about what it's like to have a disability. However, for the longest time, and they are surely well-intentioned, they have actually been condemned by disability rights activists and scholars. So let's look at why. So outright disability simulations perpetuate ableism. But let's look at the numerous ways they do that. For one, a simulation is only simulating, or I would like to say, attempting to simulate an impairment, right? If I'm walking around with a blindfold, I am trying to simulate what it's like to be blind, but you know, a blind person might say that's not my experience at all. So it focuses only on impairment rather than the experience of disability, which is much more than the impairment itself. The experience of disability is one's impairment in the context of a society which doesn't always give them access, that isn't always inclusive, that doesn't have acceptance, right? That has discrimination. So if you're trying to simulate somebody's experience, somebody's life experience, which first of all is problematic, right? Because we wouldn't simulate the experiences of other identity groups. Can you think about how problematic or even obviously offensive it would be to try to simulate the experience of another race or gender by changing one's physical appearance? In fact, many disability rights activists have sort of compared disability simulations to blackface and that kind of thing. So doing these kinds of things only reinforce negative stereotypes. They end up evoking pity because they only focus on the disability, right? So in the scenario that I just gave you, the children had to spend their day trying to do these things, and they found it hard to do it. And so the message then to them was, wow, it's really hard to have a disability and it's awful. I mean, like, what other message would I get as a child if I spent my day trying to button my coat with socks on? So they misinform, they generate feelings of fear and disorientation, lack of control, and generally this idea that disability is an awful thing, which I argue, by the way, we didn't have to take time out of the day to try to teach that. Society already believes all these negative things about disability. It's almost as if we took time out of the school day to pull children aside and give them instruction in ableism. We actually taught ableism through this activity. If one wants to talk about awareness or increase awareness, I think that it might be better to talk about disability oppression. The activities that I mentioned earlier failed to address disability oppression, raise anybody's understanding about lack of access, the barriers in society, attitudes towards people with disabilities. They failed to demonstrate that disability and disablement could be a result of lack of access tools, and that with the correct access tools, one might have been able to button that coat or navigate the hallways if one had a blindfold on, etc. So in these kinds of activities, which are promoted actually in many professional settings, and many people think this is a great way to raise empathy. In fact, issues related to ableism, stigma, prejudice, discrimination, and exclusion remain unexamined, and those are some big issues. So let's move to vignette number 2. Here we have the disability hierarchy and special needs traps. So Maria is at a community forum for parents of disabled children. She is sharing her frustration about accessing services for her daughter. She says, "My special needs daughter is on the spectrum, so she has many needs for support, mainly speech and language and social. Thankfully, she does not have any mental challenges, just mainly speech and social. I've advocated for more speech therapy and social skills group. She doesn't appear like she has any issues because she looks normal. She is not mentally challenged, thank God, but still she does need help in schools, and I will keep fighting until she gets the help." Later during that same meeting, a social worker addresses the parent and said, all the parents, saying, "I applaud you. All of you parents are actually special. God bless you. You all have inner courage and strength and so much love. I admire all special needs parents." So let's have a word about words here. Let's rethink the rhetoric of special children, special needs, special parents, special teachers, special education, right? It's all special, you know. Some people remark, if it's so special, we should all be demanding it. So this language of specialness constructs the idea of otherness, right? On the surface, it's a euphemism, it's a nice word, but it also creates that there are two kinds of children. There are two categories broadly of children, you know, regular children and special needs children. Furthermore, it reinforces this idea that special needs children are difficult to parent, teach, therefore a special person only could do it. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the discourse if you are a professional who works with people with disabilities. I certainly have had this a lot. This whole like, God bless you. Wow. You know, oh, you know, you must be a really kind and patient person. You know, parents get this a lot as well. The whole God bless you, there's a special place in heaven for you. God only selects the best people for this job. And on the surface, of course, I'm not saying that people set out to say something that's problematic. It's probably well-intentioned, but they are underneath it. We have to question, what are we really saying, right? Is it really a commentary on the professional and the parent who is so special? Doesn't it send a message about the person with the disability? If only a special person could do it and God bless you, isn't it constructing an idea about the value or the desirability of that child, right? These are ways that really we don't think about how ableism is getting tossed back and forth and kept alive through our choice of words. Also in the previous scenario, I'll go back there. Remember how Maria is careful to let us know that thank God her child only has speech and social, but not mental issues, right? So there is a disability hierarchy that is promoted, perpetuated, if you will. Some disabilities are socially more acceptable than others. And we need to rethink this, right? There's a problem with, first of all, there's ableism at large, but within the disability community or the parent community and the professional community, there's language which sort of creates this hierarchy of which disabilities are better than others, which we want, which we would be absolutely not okay with. And so that's something that we want to think about a little bit. And the third issue is many people here might be listening to me wondering why I sometimes say disabled people, sometimes I say people with disabilities. Many professionals have been taught the standard fare of person first language, right? And there's a place for that. It arose as a response to very offensive ways of addressing people with disabilities. So I can understand where that came from. Person first language is the practice of saying person first, as in a person with a disability, a man with cerebral palsy, a woman with autism, that kind of thing, right? Disability first language, or it's also called identity first language, uses disabled person, disabled man, autistic woman, and so forth. There are many in the disability rights movement and disabled activists who prefer identity first language, who say that it's akin to a cultural identity, or it's akin to saying, I am an Italian woman, or I am a South Asian woman, I am a gay man. So there are certainly two ways to approach this, and when in doubt, one could ask a person what they prefer, and sort of be sensitive to the particular group that you're talking to in terms of their preference. But we as professionals want to be aware, first of all, that this is even a thing that we need to consider, and that not everyone actually prefers person first language. Then I have my third vignette. Bianca is a behavioral therapist at Middletown School. In April, the school is planning their annual autism awareness event. Many parents and staff volunteer to help plan the event. The activities include, and many will be familiar with this, children will decorate a puzzle piece that will be displayed in the hallways, having a bake sale to raise money for autism research, learning information about the social and communication difficulties that people with autism experience, and other activities. Here's the fun part. There will be a dance social at the end of the week. The students in the 2 ABA classrooms, those are the classrooms designated for children with autism at that school, will have their own party in their classrooms, since it's believed by the staff that the school social will be too loud and overwhelming for them. There will be pizza, ice cream, and games at both parties, though. So let's talk about one of my favorite, or not favorite, topics, depending on how you look at it, autism awareness. And many might be aware that disability rights activists and self-advocates have long problematized the watered down activities done in communities and schools in the name of autism awareness. For one, let's really ask ourselves, what is up with the puzzle piece? What is it really teaching us? What's the implication, right? And also, does it teach us anything? What on earth does it teach children about autistic culture or neurodiversity or autism? It's sort of this feel-good activity that we do. You put the sticker on your car, you get your kids to color, you put together your puzzle pieces. Autism awareness, check. Let's now ask ourselves about these bake sales that are done at schools to raise money, and I won't name the organizations, that many people with autism, the autistic community actually has a problem with organizations that are raising money to cure autism instead of raising money to make life better or have more access and acceptance for people. So we got to ask ourselves, first of all, if we're raising money, like I go to the dry cleaner and there's a little jar there for my penny, right? For, I'm not going to say the name of the organization. And people put money there, but we're not asking ourselves, what is it for really? And moreover, is the group that this is in the name of approve or want the money to be collected for this reason, right? So in professional settings and institutions, we do these things all the time. We want to ask ourselves, which organizations, and you want to ask yourself, does it have autistic people in its leadership? Who is running this organization? Who have they consulted? Who is positioned as the expert? And did they have a role in designing or consulting with these activities for autism awareness? And the other thing that I want to put out there is this idea of ABA, which is one of the most common therapies that are used for autistic children in schools. In fact, many autistic adults have positioned ABA therapies as outright a form of oppression. Many consider ABA to be akin to conversion therapy that was popular, quote unquote, therapy for gay people a few decades ago. So, but yet ABA remains one of the most common treatments for autistic children. And I'll go back to my little vignette, but remember the children in the ABA classrooms had their own party because it was too overwhelming, the school social. We failed to question, first of all, it's an awareness day, and we failed to draw attention to the fact that separate but equal for these students with autism was still considered okay. And we didn't ask how we could have made the school social more accessible. Instead of saying, it's too overwhelming, they'll have their separate party, perhaps we could start asking as professionals, what can we do then to create more acceptance, to create spaces of belonging, and what are some tools and strategies that could have been done at this particular school instead? So I'm being mindful of the time, and I just have a couple more slides and we'll wrap up. But some suggestions: consider autism acceptance instead, promote acceptance of neurodiversity, which is this idea that brains are wired differently, and it's not a cure, but access and acceptance that we should be seeking. Consider raising awareness about discrimination, prejudice, segregation, and the high rates of violence actually faced by autistic community, instead of wasting our time coloring puzzle pieces and selling brownies, and promote a view of autistic culture. So here's something that I think that might be helpful for us all to look at, because there's all these words. And I think that when we are, non-disabled people approaching this conversation, or if you have a disability, right? Look at where you're positioned and how you are entering this conversation. So I thought this might be helpful. Self-advocate is someone who identifies as a member of a group, an in-group member whose issues are being centered. An advocate is someone who is connected with the group, either a professional or a family member, someone who has a relationship with someone with a disability who advocates for them. An ally is an outsider to a particular community, but works to support the agendas of that community. So that's really important. If you want to work towards allyship, we want to look at what are the agendas of a particular community. And an activist is someone who takes broad public action at the local community or policy level. So because my presentation is really about allyship and how we can look at all the ways in which we are inadvertently sort of complicit, if you will, in ableism. And I end with some ideas for how we can begin to work towards disability justice. So for one, let's try to make it our our agenda to align with the disability rights agenda, learn about disability history and disability culture from the disability community, not experts or those people who have been positioned as experts who are non-disabled. We want to check out able-bodied privilege. Alicia, I am going to wrap up in literally 1 minute, and understand the value of centering the perspectives of people with disabilities. Don't forget intersectionality. People are not just one identity. People could be disabled, members of ethnic, racial, people have gender identity. And so you want to look at how all of these intersect with each other, examine ableism as the root of the problem, and explore ways to nurture a positive identity and disability pride among youth with disabilities. And I end with one of my favorite quotes. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So I leave you with that. And that's what I have.
Priya, it's Alicia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. If you needed to take 5 more minutes, I was trying to be able to let
Oh.
you know that you didn't have to rush through the end.
I'm good. I got through all of them.
Yes, you did. And we thank you so much. That was such an amazing presentation. So much great information. I feel like you're so amazing to be able to talk to all of us about that. So I have one question here for you. So what are your thoughts on go-to strategies to disrupt ableism when you want to call people out instead of calling them in, instead of calling them out? So like if you want to have more of that kind of personal conversation as opposed to calling them out in the situation, do you have any kind of suggestions for people?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I get this, I work with teachers. I'm a teacher educator, as I said, and I get this question a lot from teachers. And, this kind of presentation or learning this kind of information, we often run the risk as, especially young people and even professionals who are learning about justice, to want to call people out, right? And I often have my students who are like, well, I heard this the other day and I told them this is wrong. And when our own justice is sort of, we are ignited, we can run the risk of going about it in the way that is probably not the best. So I think instead of calling people out and saying, oh, that's ableist, or, that's offensive, I think that the better way to do it maybe is to say, did you know that many disabled activists actually are talking about how problematic it is to them, and then direct them to a resource or a reading or a YouTube video in which someone is talking about language and so forth. And there's so much out there. So I prefer, instead of saying, I'm saying that's offensive, or I'm saying that's wrong, or you're being ableist, I think it's better to just take a more an educative stance, or to just say, I wonder if you would consider that this might be upsetting to some people, and here's something that you can read about it.
Okay, thank you so much. Do you have any comment or any, somebody asked about the book Wonder is a frequently used book that's taught in schools, for example, and kind of related that to the redemption for non-disabled people. Do you have any thoughts or opinions on Wonder?
Wow, I love that question. Thank you. I sometimes bring this up. So I love the book Wonder. I like it. I love it. There's a lot good about it. But there are a couple of things that I actually did wonder about, no pun intended. For one, yes, the redemption narrative is there, no doubt, right? All these kids, they learned. It's like disability or difference is there to teach other people something. But there's another thing in there that I picked up on, which was alarming to me a little bit, in that on a couple of occasions, if not more, characters in the book said, well, of course he's not retarded. sorry to use, I don't like to use I prefer to say the R word, but it's, it's in the book. Or no, he should not go to the special needs class because, he has no mental problems at all, So it's like that hierarchy. It's like, oh, he only has a facial difference, but he's not really special needs. And I mean, the R word came up in the book a couple of times. And I was hoping that at some point in the book, there would be a moment where the teacher or the parents, like, there was a moment where they were like, oh, I've realized why this is a problem, or why this word is a problem, but that never came. And the idea that, of course, Augie should be in that classroom, of course he belongs there, because he only has a facial difference and not really any real special needs, was actually more problematic to me than even the redemption narrative. Now, having said that, I'll also say that there is a lot great about the book. So I don't want people, and I'm not a fan of banning books, by the way, and saying, by the way, and I work with my teachers, even with solidly offensive narratives, and they say, well, then should we just, not use these, or should we just toss them out? I am of the belief, my work is about inviting children to be agents of change. And we will not do that if we just tell them what's not good and what's good and what's ableist and what's not. And so I think it's great to invite children to read the book and to ask them, well, what do you think about this? Teach them about redemption narrative, give them the tools, teach them about, well, what do you think about, they're saying this about, should Augie belong? Well, should not anyone belong in the classroom? What do you think? So I hope I answered your question. Don't toss the book. It's a great book, whoever asked, but please do invite children to critique it.
Yeah, so this kind of connects to what you're just speaking about. Someone asked if you have suggestions on how to help elementary students like address ableism directly. So I think you're sort of connecting to that.
Yeah. Like you said earlier, I am co-author of Undoing Ableism. So, I mean, literally there's a book that answers your question. The book is actually entirely structured as a resource guide for educators or anyone who chooses to take on these conversations with children. It has a number of ways in which you can draw children's attention to stereotypes, to ableism, to teach them to become critical consumers, invite them to look at film clips, compare them with a guest speaker that comes in, say, okay, so we saw this, but now we're going to meet somebody with this disability, and let's sort of do a Venn diagram, or, let's try to analyze, do some critical thinking here. Let's investigate our school to see if it really complies with ADA. Like, wouldn't that be a great math lesson to walk around the school during your measurement, which is already part of your curriculum? Yeah, so I'm suggesting that we don't need a disability awareness day or a month or anything. You don't need to take time out to teach these things. Just infuse them in what you're already doing. If you're teaching children measurement, introduce the ADA guideline for doorways and how many inches they're supposed to be. And then for our assignment, you'll walk around the school, measure every doorway and compare it and do an analysis, create a graph, create a chart, and then feel free to do a letter writing campaign. That's part of your language arts. It's all infused in existing lessons. And that can just sort of, oh, wow, I didn't know this. I didn't realize this. That's disability awareness.
Victor, are you sending us off here?
It's now just 1 minute before the hour, which has sped by. And while we do have other questions, unfortunately, we have a hard stop at 1 o'clock. So at this point, I want to thank Dr. Priya Lalvani for joining us today and presenting us with a great deal to think about this afternoon. Also delighted that we were able to co-host today's presentation with the DNEA, and thank you, Alicia, very much for everything that you did in making this happen today. I want to remind everyone who joined us on today's Zoom webinar that you will be receiving at the conclusion of today's event a survey, which we ask you to fill out and return it to us just as soon as you are able. Thank you, everyone, once again, and have a pleasant afternoon.
Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Priya.